Disclaimer: picture a chessboard where one player controls all the pieces and the other just realize they're not even sitting at the table. That's the game unfolding across North America right now, and it took exactly 6 days for the mask to come off. January 3rd, 2026. American Special Operations Forces executed what the Pentagon labeled Operation Absolute Resolve. The target? Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, extracted from his own country, placed in U.S. custody, his administration dismantled within hours. A sitting head of state, handcuffed, transferred to American control, naval assets enforcing a complete perimeter around Venezuelan waters. The government structure gone, replaced with what Washington called interim administrative oversight. Brazil issued formal protests. Colombia called emergency diplomatic meetings. Spain condemned the action in the strongest terms. Even Mexico's foreign ministry released carefully worded statements expressing deep concern about unilateral military operations in the hemisphere. The United Nations Security Council convened within 48 hours. International legal scholars published urgent analyses explaining why this violated 70 years of established norms. Foreign policy journals called it the most significant breach of sovereignty since the Iraq invasion. But here's what almost everyone missed while focusing on Venezuela. Venezuela wasn't the objective. Venezuela was the advertisement. Because 6 days after those images circulated worldwide, January 9th, President Trump sat down for a Fox News interview and said something that should have triggered alarm bells across every capital in Latin America. When the host asked about cartel violence affecting American communities, Trump didn't deliver standard talking points about enhanced border security or improved law enforcement cooperation. Instead, he stated, "We're going to start now hitting land. Not considering military options, not reviewing potential responses, not working with Mexican authorities. Start now, present tense, active operations, military strikes against targets inside Mexican territory. Let's understand what happened in that 6-day window." The United States military conducted a full-spectrum operation against a sovereign government, captured its leader, dissolved its institutions, announced indefinite American administration of Venezuelan affairs. Then, before the international community could even formulate a coherent response, Washington declared that Mexico, America's largest trading partner, the destination for $450 billion in annual U.S. exports, the country sharing a 2,000-mile border with us, was next. You might be thinking this is about fentanyl, about cartel violence, about stopping drug flows and securing the southern border. And yes, those are the narratives being fed to cable news audiences and congressional hearings. But if you track the money, if you map the policy mechanisms, if you follow the timeline of what's converging right now, you'll see something far more calculated than a war on drugs. This is about leverage. Specifically, it's about applying maximum pressure at the precise moment when your target has minimum capacity to resist. Here's what's actually unfolding, and why Trump's January 9th statement matters less for what he said and more for when he said it. Mexico faces 3 converging pressure points in 2026, not spread across the year, not manageable as separate challenges, all 3 arriving simultaneously, right as Trump announces military intervention. These aren't accidents, these are engineered collision points. First, the USMCA trade review. Remember when Trump renegotiated NAFTA in 2018? Most people focused on the name change, USMCA replacing NAFTA. What they missed was a mechanism Trump inserted that had never existed in the original agreement, a mandatory review, 6 years after implementation. July 1st, 2026. Under the old NAFTA framework, the agreement was permanent unless one party actively withdrew with 6 months' notice. Businesses could make decade-long investments knowing the rules were stable. Supply chains could develop with confidence that tariff structures wouldn't suddenly change. Trump eliminated that stability completely. USMCA requires all 3 nations, United States, Mexico, Canada, to formally agree by July 1st to extend the framework for 16 years. If they can't reach unanimous agreement, the deal doesn't die immediately. Instead, it enters annual review cycles where any country can trigger withdrawal, starting a 10-year countdown to complete termination in 2036. Think of it like this. Imagine you own a factory in Mexico producing automotive parts for American manufacturers. Under the old system, you could plan 15 years ahead, build facilities, train workers, establish relationships. The rules were fixed. Under the new system, starting this July, you face annual uncertainty about whether your tariff-free access to U.S. markets will still exist 12 months from now. You can't make multi-year investments when the entire framework might collapse with one policy announcement. The uncertainty alone is devastating. But Trump doesn't need to actually terminate USMCA to weaponize this pressure. He just needs the threat to be credible. And after capturing Maduro and announcing strikes on Mexican territory, his threats have never carried more weight. The U.S. Trade Representative submitted the mandatory review documentation to Congress on January the 2nd, 9 days ago. Those plans are confidential, but Mexican officials know what's in them because behind closed-door negotiations have been running for months. Second pressure point, the Supreme Court tariff ruling. Since Trump's second term began, the United States has collected over $200 billion in new tariffs. Steel, aluminum, Chinese electronics, Mexican automotive parts, Canadian lumber, billions extracted from global trade flows. Multiple legal challenges to this tariff authority have worked through federal courts. The central question, can the president impose tariffs unilaterally using national security justifications without congressional approval? All those cases have now reached the Supreme Court. The ruling is expected January 14th, 5 days from now. If the court rules against Trump, the government might face refund obligations totaling that entire $200 billion. But if the court upholds his authority, and legal scholars overwhelmingly predict they will give him the 6-3 conservative majority, Trump gains something far more powerful than money. He gains validated, court-confirmed authority to impose tariffs on any country, at any time, for any reason he can frame as national security. No congressional vote required, no judicial review available, complete executive discretion. Against Mexico, immediately. Third pressure point, the cartel terrorist designations. February 2025, Trump designated 6 Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations: Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, Northeast Cartel, Juarez Cartel. At the time, it looked like tough-on-crime political theater. These groups were already known as violent criminal enterprises. The designation seemed symbolic, except nothing about this was symbolic. Under U.S. law, designating an organization as a foreign terrorist entity creates immediate legal authorities. Financial asset seizures, sanctions against anyone providing material support, intelligence sharing restrictions. And most critically for what's happening right now, legal justification for military operations against terrorist targets, regardless of where those targets are located, even inside allied countries, even without host nation permission. Think about what just converged in January 2026. Trade leverage through the mandatory USMCA review with Mexico, its entire export economy on the line. Economic leverage through Supreme Court-validated tariff authority that can be deployed instantly. Military leverage through terrorist designations that legally justify cross-border operations. 3 separate policy mechanisms activated at different times over the past 2 years, all reaching critical mass simultaneously. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum saw this convergence developing. She's not naive about geopolitics or American power projection. So she started making concessions immediately after taking office in October 2024. Thousands of Mexican military personnel deployed to the U.S. border, not to stop Americans from entering Mexico, but to stop Central American migrants from reaching the United States. Dozens of high-value cartel leaders transferred to American custody without formal extradition proceedings. Agreement to accept deportees from third countries, not Mexican nationals, but migrants from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, that the U.S. doesn't want and Mexico has zero obligation to receive. These weren't minor diplomatic gestures. These were sovereignty violations that would have sparked massive domestic protests under previous Mexican administrations. Sheinbaum absorbed the political damage, made the deals, hoped it would be enough to avoid what she knew was coming. It wasn't enough. Trump's January 9th statement made that brutally clear. The cartels are running Mexico, speaking about a country that just deployed thousands of troops at U.S. request, that just handed over cartel kingpins without court proceedings, that just agreed to warehouse migrants we're deporting. According to the President of the United States, even after all those concessions, Mexico remains cartel territory requiring American military intervention. Mexican policy analysts understood immediately what this actually signals. One researcher told international media, "This isn't about stopping drug trafficking. It's a negotiation weapon to extract commercial, diplomatic, and political advantages before the July USMCA review. $760 billion in annual trade hanging in the balance. The Supreme Court about to validate unlimited tariff authority. Terrorist designations creating legal cover for military operations. And Venezuela burning in the background as proof that America will actually follow through. Think about the message being transmitted here. We just conducted a military operation that violated every principle of international law. Captured a sitting president. Dissolved his government, announced indefinite American administration of his country. The international community condemned it. Regional allies publicly protested. The United Nations held emergency sessions. And 6 days later, we announced Mexico is next. That's not a policy announcement. That's a demonstration of capability. That's a signal that legal constraints, diplomatic consequences, and international norms mean absolutely nothing when strategic interests are at stake. Venezuela was the proof of concept. Mexico is the actual target. What's either terrifying or strategically brilliant, depending on your perspective, is how completely Mexico is trapped. As America's #1 trading partner, surpassing even China as of 2024, any serious disruption to trade flows would devastate Mexico's economy. 80% of Mexican exports flow to the United States. We're talking about an economic relationship where Mexico has everything to lose and America controls every leverage point. The Venezuela operation proved Trump will use force. The USMCA review creates a mandatory negotiation deadline. The Supreme Court ruling validates the tariff weapon. The terrorist designations provide legal justification. And Sheinbaum's concessions prove that even total capitulation on previous demands won't satisfy the next round of pressure. So here's what you need to understand as we move into the next few months. This isn't about drug cartels. This isn't about border security. This isn't about immigration enforcement. Those are the public-facing narratives designed for cable news soundbites. The actual mechanism is something far more calculated. The weaponization of trade policy, military force, and legal designations, all converging on a single point. Forcing Mexico to accept USMCA terms they would never agree to under normal circumstances. Terms that will reshape North American economic relationships for the next 16 years. Terms that will determine which country controls automotive manufacturing, semiconductor supply chains, access to critical rare earth minerals, and energy infrastructure. Venezuela was the opening move in a hemispheric pressure campaign. Mexico is the real objective. And everything happening right now, every troop deployment, every cartel designation, every trade negotiation, is building toward a deadline that arrives in exactly 169 days. The question isn't whether Mexico will face American military intervention. The question is what Mexico will agree to in order to avoid it. What's unfolding with Mexico isn't improvisation. It's a carefully tested sequence we've already watched execute once, and the results speak for themselves. Venezuela wasn't a one-off military adventure. It was a proof of concept. If you track the timeline of how we dismantled Maduro's government, you'll see the exact same pattern now repeating with Mexico, step by identical step. Here's how the Venezuela operation actually developed. Pay close attention, because we're watching it replay in real time. Step 1, legal classification. 2023, well before most Americans were paying attention, the U.S. government classified the entire Venezuelan state as a narcotics trafficking organization. Not just sanctioned officials, not blacklisted individuals, the government itself. At the time, it seemed like standard rhetoric against a socialist regime we opposed. But that designation accomplished something critical. It established legal justification for everything that followed. Step 2, naval blockade. September 2025, U.S. Navy vessels began intercepting ships in Caribbean waters under the banner of counter-narcotics operations. The official narrative, stopping drug smuggling routes. But those ships weren't just intercepting fishing boats with hidden cocaine compartments. They were stopping oil tankers headed to Cuba, container ships bound for Chinese ports, vessels carrying Venezuelan exports to any destination that wasn't the United States. We called it a blockade on drug trafficking. Venezuela called it an act of war. Both descriptions were accurate. Step 3, military strikes. Between September and December 2025, U.S. forces conducted 35 separate operations against what the Pentagon described as narcotics transportation vessels in Venezuelan territorial waters. Official reports, 115 people killed. The Venezuelan government claimed they were fishermen and civilian sailors. The U.S. maintained they were cartel operatives. What's undisputed, we conducted offensive military operations inside another country's territorial waters for 3 solid months, escalating pressure systematically. Step 4. Regime removal. January 3rd, 2026. Operation Absolute Resolve. Special forces on the ground. Maduro in custody. Government dissolved. Immediate announcement that the United States would administer Venezuelan affairs until oil infrastructure can be rebuilt under proper management. Not temporarily occupy, not supervise a transition, administer indefinitely. Now, let's look at Mexico. See if this pattern sounds familiar. February 2025, Trump designated 6 Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Sinaloa, Jalisco, Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, Northeast Juarez. Just like Venezuela, this created the legal framework for everything that follows. These aren't criminals subject to law enforcement procedures. They're terrorists subject to military action. December 2025, Mexico violated the 1944 U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty by failing to deliver required water allocations to Texas farmers. Trump immediately threatened 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports unless compliance improved. This wasn't about water rights or agricultural policy. This was about establishing a pattern of Mexican non-compliance with treaty obligations, creating justification for escalating pressure. January 9th, 2026, Trump announces, "We're going to start now hitting land against Mexican cartels." Not planning to hit land, not considering hitting land. Start now, present tense. Immediate action. You see the sequence? Legal designation, economic pressure, announcement of military action. The only thing missing is the actual strikes. And if you take Trump's word choice seriously, start now, those might already be happening in ways the public hasn't been briefed about yet. But here's what makes the Mexico situation even more dangerous than Venezuela. The economic leverage is exponentially greater because of how Trump restructured NAFTA in 2018. Most people remember that Trump called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever made and threatened to withdraw completely. What they don't remember is the specific mechanism he inserted when he renegotiated it into USMCA. That mechanism is the entire game right now. NAFTA had no expiration date. It was permanent unless one country actively withdrew with 6 months' notice. That meant the trade relationship was stable, predictable, protected from political turbulence. Companies could make 20-year investments, knowing the rules wouldn't change every election cycle. Trump eliminated that stability completely. USMCA includes the mandatory 2026 review, exactly 6 years after implementation. All 3 countries must agree by July 1st to extend the agreement for another 16 years. If they can't reach agreement, the deal doesn't die immediately. Instead, it enters annual review cycles where any country can withdraw, creating a 10-year countdown to full termination in 2036. That might sound like a reasonable compromise, a chance to update the deal for changing conditions. In practice, it's a loaded weapon pointed at Mexico's economy with Trump's finger on the trigger. Because here's what happens if Mexico refuses whatever terms the United States demands this summer. Every single year, from 2027 through 2036, American companies operating in Mexico or importing Mexican goods face the possibility that next year the whole framework collapses. You can't make 10-year factory investments when the trade agreement might not survive 12 months. You can't build supply chains when tariff-free access could disappear with one presidential announcement. The uncertainty alone would be catastrophic. But Trump doesn't need to actually terminate USMCA to weaponize this leverage. He just needs to threaten it credibly. And after capturing Maduro and announcing military operations against Mexican territory, the credibility of his threats has never been higher. The U.S. Trade Representative submitted the required review plans to Congress on January 2nd. Those plans remain confidential, but Mexican officials know what's in them because back-channel negotiations have been running for months. According to analysts familiar with these negotiations, the U.S. is demanding 3 major concessions Mexico would never accept under normal circumstances. First, new automotive rules of origin requiring even higher percentages of North American content in vehicles, qualifying for tariff-free treatment, effectively forcing car manufacturers to shift production from Mexico to the United States. Second, Chinese investment restrictions, preventing Chinese companies from using Mexico as a backdoor entry point to U.S. markets, potentially forcing Mexico to choose between Chinese capital and American market access. Third, forced labor prohibitions that sound humanitarian but actually target specific Mexican industries where labor cost advantages make them competitive against American producers. These aren't minor technical adjustments. These are fundamental restructuring demands that would reshape Mexico's entire industrial policy. And they're being presented with a simple ultimatum. Accept these terms by July, or watch USMCA enter terminal decline, while we impose tariffs that make Venezuelan economic collapse look gentle by comparison. Now add the Supreme Court ruling into this equation. January 14th, 5 days from now, the court is expected to rule on the legal authority for Trump's tariff regime. Multiple cases have challenged whether the president can impose tariffs without congressional approval using national security justifications. Legal experts overwhelmingly expect the court to uphold Trump's authority. Why? Because the justices he appointed create a 6-3 conservative majority. And that majority has consistently favored expansive executive power in foreign affairs and national security matters. If that ruling comes down as expected, Trump gains something extraordinary: confirmed legal authority to impose tariffs on any country at any time, for any reason he can frame as national security. No congressional vote required, no judicial review available, complete discretion. Against Mexico, this means he can impose 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports tomorrow if Sheinbaum does not accept his USMCA demands. He doesn't need to wait for the July review. He doesn't need to negotiate further. He can simply devastate Mexico's export economy with executive action, then offer to lift the tariffs once Mexico agrees to his terms. This is why Mexico's economic vulnerability isn't just significant, it's absolute. As America's #1 trading partner as of 2024, surpassing China, Mexico sends 80% of its exports to the United States. Automotive manufacturing, electronics assembly, agricultural products, petroleum. All of it flows north because that's where the purchasing power is. The United States has already collected $200 billion in new tariffs since Trump's second term began. That's $200 billion extracted from somewhere, from companies, from consumers, from trading partners who had to absorb the costs or lose market access. With the Supreme Court about to validate that collection authority, Trump can do it again whenever he wants. Mexico has no equivalent weapon. They can't impose reciprocal tariffs that hurt the United States more than they hurt themselves. They can't redirect exports to other markets that have the scale and wealth of American consumers. They can't even threaten to reduce trade because their economy needs our market far more than we need theirs. This asymmetry is why Sheinbaum started making concessions immediately after taking office. She deployed thousands of troops to stop Central American migrants. She transferred cartel leaders to American custody. She agreed to accept deportees from third countries. These were massive sovereignty violations that previous Mexican presidents would never have accepted. Trump's response? The cartels are running Mexico. That statement wasn't an assessment of Mexican security conditions. It was a declaration that no amount of Mexican compliance will ever be enough. Because the goal isn't actually stopping cartels, securing borders, or controlling migration. The goal is extracting maximum concessions in the USMCA review, while Mexico has zero leverage to refuse. Venezuela proved that the United States will use military force against sovereign nations when strategic interests are at stake. The USMCA review creates a mandatory negotiation deadline with Mexico's entire economic model on the line. The Supreme Court ruling validates unlimited tariff authority. The terrorist designations provide legal cover for military operations. Every piece is in position. The pattern has been tested. The deadline is approaching. And Mexico's choice isn't whether to comply. It's how much sovereignty they'll surrender to avoid economic collapse. Let's do the math on what's actually about to happen. July 1st, 2026. That's the official deadline, 169 days from today. On that date, the United States, Mexico, and Canada must all agree to extend USMCA for another 16 years, or the agreement enters annual review cycles leading to termination in 2036. But here's what makes this deadline more than just a calendar date. Trump has already publicly stated he will invoke the 6-year renegotiation provision he personally inserted into the agreement back in 2018. He's not entering this review as a neutral party, evaluating whether the current deal still works. He's entering with demands, new terms, fundamental restructuring of how North American trade operates. And Mexico has exactly two options: accept those terms or lose duty-free access to the $28 trillion U.S. economy that represents 80% of their exports. Think about what that binary choice actually means in practice. Mexican automotive manufacturers either accept new rules of origin that force production shifts to the United States, or they face 25% tariffs that make their products non-competitive in American markets. Mexican electronics assembly plants either comply with Chinese investment restrictions that cut them off from capital sources, or they lose access to American retailers and tech companies. Mexican agricultural exporters either accept forced labor certifications that increase their costs, or they watch American consumers buy from other countries instead. There's no third option here. There's no let's agree to disagree and maintain the current framework. The USMCA review isn't a suggestion. It's a mandatory renegotiation, where failure to agree triggers the terminal countdown. And Trump has made crystal clear he's not entering this negotiation to preserve the status quo. Let's talk about what happens if Mexico tries to reject these demands. Because Venezuela already showed us exactly how that story ends. January 4th, 2026, one day after U.S. forces captured Maduro, 6 Latin American countries issued a joint statement condemning the operation. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, Chile, Uruguay. They called it a violation of international law and demanded immediate withdrawal of American forces from Venezuelan territory. These weren't minor countries issuing symbolic protests. These were major regional powers, some of them close U.S. allies, publicly breaking with American foreign policy. January 5th, the UN Security Council held emergency meetings. Multiple countries pushed for resolutions demanding American withdrawal. International law experts from dozens of nations published analyses explaining why Operation Absolute Resolve violated the UN Charter, the Organization of American States Charter, and fundamental principles of sovereignty that have governed international relations since World War II. The Brookings Institution, one of America's most respected foreign policy think tanks, issued a report warning that the Venezuela operation undermines U.S. standing on issues we claim to care about, specifically mentioning Eastern Europe and Taiwan. The argument was straightforward. If the United States can invade a sovereign nation, capture its leader, and install interim governance whenever we claim there's a security threat, then Russia has the same justification for Ukraine, and China has the same justification for Taiwan. We're dismantling the international order we spent 70 years building. Trump's response to all of this condemnation, all these diplomatic protests, all these warnings about long-term consequences, he announced the United States will administer Venezuelan affairs indefinitely until oil infrastructure is rebuilt to our satisfaction. Not temporarily occupy, not supervise a transition. Run the country indefinitely until we decide we're done. That response tells you everything you need to know about whether legal constraints, diplomatic blowback, or international law matter when American strategic interests are at stake. They don't, at all. So when Mexico looks at the pressure being applied right now, the terrorist designations, the tariff threats, the military intervention announcements, they're not seeing bluffs or negotiating tactics. They're seeing demonstrated willingness to use force regardless of international opinion, legal frameworks, or diplomatic relationships. The Venezuela precedent isn't just proof that Trump will act. It's proof that nothing will stop him from acting once he's decided to pursue a strategic goal, not allies, not treaties, not international institutions, not public opinion, nothing. Which brings us to the specific timeline Mexico is actually facing. And this is where the calculation becomes unavoidable. Analysts who follow U.S. Mexico trade negotiations closely project that Trump will demand formal agreements by May 2026, not July 1st, when the USMCA review technically concludes. May orders 2 months earlier. Why? Because any deals need time for implementation planning, legal review, and political approval processes in all 3 countries. If Mexico waits until June to accept U.S. terms, there won't be enough time to finalize documentation before the July deadline triggers the annual review mechanism. So the real deadline isn't 169 days from now, it's 138 days, May 2026, less than 5 months. What specific demands will Trump make by that May deadline? Based on negotiations that have already been happening behind closed doors, analysts expect the package to include 2 major components: security concessions and trade restructuring. On the security side, Mexico will face a choice between 2 frameworks. Option 1, explicit authorization for U.S. anti-cartel operations on Mexican soil, not joint operations, not coordinated raids with Mexican forces in command, American military and intelligence personnel conducting unilateral operations inside Mexico whenever we identify high-value cartel targets. This would be the most severe sovereignty violation, essentially creating American military presence on Mexican territory with freedom of action to conduct combat operations. Option 2, a security cooperation framework modeled on Plan Colombia from the 2000s. Remember how that played out? Colombia faced a narco-terrorism crisis with FARC guerrillas controlling large portions of the country. The United States offered billions in military aid, training, intelligence support, and direct operational assistance. In exchange, Colombia gave American forces significant presence and operational latitude within their borders. The program lasted for decades and fundamentally reshaped Colombia's military and political relationship with the United States. Mexico has always refused to consider a Plan Colombia model because Colombian officials themselves admit the program violated sovereignty and created long-term dependency on American support. But that was before Trump captured Maduro. On the trade side, the demands are more technical but equally transformative. Trump will push for new automotive local content requirements that mandate higher percentages of parts manufactured in the United States, effectively forcing car companies to shift production from Mexico to American factories. He'll demand Chinese investment screening mechanisms that give the U.S. veto power over which companies can operate in Mexico, preventing Chinese manufacturers from using Mexico as a backdoor to American markets. And he'll insist on semiconductor supply chain integration that ties Mexican electronics manufacturing to American-controlled component sourcing. Each of these demands individually would represent a major economic concession. Together, they amount to restructuring Mexico's entire industrial policy around American interests rather than Mexican development goals. And here's the final pressure point that makes Mexican refusal impossible. The Supreme Court tariff ruling expected January 14th. When that ruling validates Trump's tariff authority, and again, legal analysts overwhelmingly expect it will, he gains immediate power to impose 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports without congressional approval or judicial review. Not in July, when the USMCA review concludes. Not in May, when the negotiation deadline arrives. Immediately, this week. That means if Sheinbaum refuses the security framework or the trade concessions, Trump doesn't have to wait months to apply economic pressure. He can impose tariffs that same day, creating instant economic crisis that forces Mexico back to the negotiating table within weeks rather than months. Mexican economists have modeled what 25% tariffs would do to their economy. Within 90 days, automotive production down 40%. Electronics exports collapsed, agricultural sectors facing bankruptcy, peso in freefall, inflation spiking above 20%, unemployment doubling. We're talking about economic devastation that would make the 1994 peso crisis look minor by comparison. And all of that happens without a single American soldier crossing the border, without firing a shot, without conducting a Venezuela-style military operation. Just tariffs, just economic pressure, just denial of market access that Mexico's entire export economy depends on. So here's the calculation that keeps Sheinbaum awake at night. Accept sovereignty violations and economic restructuring that her political opponents will call surrender or refuse, and watch her country's economy collapse within months, while Trump points to the USMCA review failure as justification for unlimited tariffs. There's no good choice. There's no diplomatic solution. There's no international coalition that will rescue Mexico from American pressure. Brazil can issue statements. The UN can hold meetings. International law experts can publish papers. None of it matters because Trump has demonstrated he will ignore all of it when strategic goals are at stake. Mexico's deadline arrives in 138 days. By May 2026, Sheinbaum must either accept terms that violate Mexican sovereignty and economic independence or face tariffs that destroy her country's export economy. The Venezuela operation proved Trump will use military force when he wants to. The USMCA review creates legal justification for economic coercion. The Supreme Court ruling validates the tariff weapon. The terrorist designations provide cover for military operations if economic pressure isn't enough. Every mechanism is in place, every precedent has been set, every deadline is approaching. And the only question left is whether Mexico surrenders its sovereignty quietly to avoid economic collapse, or loudly after experiencing it. That's not a negotiation. That's not a trade review. That's calculated application of overwhelming pressure against a neighbor who has no ability to resist. Welcome to Hemispheric Strategy in 2026. Venezuela was the proof of concept. Mexico is the actual target. And the deadline is counting down whether they're ready or not.